According to Greek historian Thucydides, fear is among the three strongest motives for human action. Specifically, it can drive us towards inaction, but also it can propel us towards action. Fear is, of course, rooted in nature. Zanet Liana, who studied PTSD in chickadees, states that avoiding being preyed upon out of fear is one of the driving forces for natural selection. Liana proposes that fear keeps animals out of harm's way, as, in a fear-induced state, animals will reduce feeding times and avoid exposure in order to mitigate predation. In essence, fear here serves as a barrier. Yet today, fear for many of us is not a matter of life or death. Instead, it largely consists of the fear of failing at some task or goal. In fact, a study of 1,083 adults by Linkagol found that 30% of Americans have this exact fear. With this in mind, the traditional role of fear as a barrier might need some reconsideration. We need to ask ourselves, should we further pursue a goal when encountering the fear of a potential failure that plagues many of us? I argue that for most ordinary cases, the fear of failure serving as a barrier we cannot do that, as it can have dire consequences, and confronting the fear of failure can build qualities that are essential for success. Before detailing why this is the case, it is worth exploring the prevalence of fear as a barrier. Albert Bandura, a psychologist at Stanford who specializes in human response to various situations, explains that fear serving as a barrier arises from our own thinking, that we will be unable to cope with the outcome of failure. From this, it is understood that the fear of failure arises from our own thinking. It is a matter of self-perception. Expanding on Bandura's interpretation, Murray Sidman, a behavioral scientist who focuses on how organisms avoid aversive stimuli, suggests that not only is fear self-made, but we often over-exaggerate our own fears. He proposes the idea that people frequently associate fear with certain stimuli that should not induce fear to the extent to which we perceive it. Combining these perspectives, it is obvious why the fear of failure is so prevalent, and why it's serving as a barrier is so prevalent, as we often over-exaggerate our fears. No one can be blamed for being detracted from a task due to a fear that is so overhyped in their mind. For one experiencing such a fear, it may feel as if it is impossible to move forward with that task, which, going back to Liana, is most likely a natural consequence. Despite these limiting effects, let's now explore the consequences of allowing fear to serve as a barrier. Milton Spett, a cognitive behavioral psychologist specialized in dealing with anxiety, states that as one shies away from their fears, those fears will only grow, making it even harder for one to overcome whatever it is that's creating that fear. An additional consequence is that when fear serves as a barrier, it doesn't allow for personal growth. Carol Dweck, a professor of psychology at Stanford who focuses on helping others with personal development, proposes the idea of the growth mindset. The growth mindset suggests that people can improve through both effort and failure, which would include facing the fear of failure. If one allows fear to serve as a barrier, then they will never experience failure, which could potentially help them grow. These perspectives demonstrate how harmful fear serving as a barrier can be. But now let's analyze the other side. When one confronts the fear of failure, there can actually be several benefits, one of which is a boost in motivation. Katinka van der Quage studied the motivation of 171 participants who played a simple game. Her results showed that motivation was highest in those who were almost always winning, but significantly dropped off for those who were winning all of the time. We can interpret this in the terms of fear of failure. For those who were winning all of the time, the fear of failure must have been minimal. But for those who lost occasionally, it must have been much more significant. From this, we see that some degree of the fear of failure maximizes motivation. Yet, what can motivation do for us? According to David Cook and Anthony Artino, researchers in understanding the psychology behind academic motivation, motivation is essential for sustained success. From both of these perspectives, we can now draw the conclusion that the fear of failure is indirectly linked to success through motivation. Yet, if one allows fear to serve as a barrier, none of this is possible. we see a similar relationship between that of resilience and the fear of failure. David Yeager and Carol Dweck, both professors of psychology who focus on the psychology of one's mindset, define resilience as whether or not one responds positively to adversity. In the context of the fear of failure, this means that resilience can certainly arise when the fear of failure is present. To illustrate this, I would like to point to Doris Lessing's chapter Through the Tunnel in her novel, The Habit of Loving. The story consists of a young boy named Jerry who desperately wants to swim through an underwater tunnel. He attempts to swim a few times, but initially fails. However, his determination only grows despite his fears for potentially drowning, the unknown, or failure. In the end, he is willing to die trying to swim through the tunnel. And on his final attempt, he is successful. This story solidifies the fact that resilience increases when the fear of failure is present, as Jerry's determination was only heightened in the face of the prolonged fear of failure. Yet it also demonstrates something else. It suggests that resilience can contribute to success. Without resilience, Jerry would have never found success in swimming through the tunnel and would have most likely given up after his first attempt. Similar to that of the fear of failure, or similar to that of motivation, we see that success can be found when the fear of failure does not serve as a barrier, as confronting the fear of failure leads to gains in resilience, which in turn increases the likelihood of success. Despite the gains from confronting the fear of failure, there is one specific limitation to my proposal, and that is fear in extreme cases. When it is a matter of life or death, our natural response to fear, allowing it to serve as a barrier, is most likely the best course of action. However, this does not discount the fact that there can still be gains in both motivation and resilience when one confronts extreme fears. It's just that the cost of failure will be much higher. To be clear, my proposal should be limited to simple fears that do not incur extreme risks such as death. Although nature intended for fear to be a limiting force or a barrier, in modern times that definition has been changed. When one allows the fear of failure to serve as a barrier, they allow it to serve as a barrier for success. On the other hand, if one confronts their fears, there can be gains in qualities such as motivation and resilience that ultimately contribute to one's own personal success.
Okay. All right, Luke, my question for you is, how did some preliminary information you gathered inform your research?
So initially, I actually began researching endurance. And throughout my work there, I found a lot of research on athletics. Particularly, one source was E.V. Kudryavtsev's When Running is the Basic Form of Activity. And it highlighted how running and endurance sports in general can actually lower people's stress and heighten their ability to succeed, which I thought was fairly interesting, but it was so limited to athletics, all the work on there, that I had to move on. And so from there, I moved on to fear. And I wanted to see what were the benefits initially of whenever someone confronts the fear of failure, and what were those potential benefits. And that's when I found all my work on motivation and resilience. Another source that I didn't mention in the slideshow that sort of reinforced Van der Weij's point was Lisa Wolf's and Jeffrey Smith's study. Their paper was titled "The Consequence on Consequence: Motivation, Anxiety, and Test Performance," where they arrived at a similar conclusion to that of Van der Weij, that there is a link between motivation and the fear of failure, except they studied grades. They divided two different groups of students into one where a test affected their GPA and one where it didn't. And for those where it affected their GPA, they had a higher degree of the fear of failure, and that of course would mean a higher degree of motivation to study. So they arrived at a similar conclusion. And so that's when I found a lot of that research, which helped mold sort of even my question and my thesis to one that was more about, should we allow fear to serve as a barrier? So I realized these benefits, and then I settled on that.
Very good. How did you use the conclusions or questions of others to advance your own research?
So I had three main techniques for doing this, for using different conclusions, one of which you saw multiple times for motivation and resilience. and that is I'm taking two different ideas and blending them together, two different conclusions, and blending them together to fit my own argument. Because I had these two different ideas of the fear of failure motivation, that link, and the motivation and success in that link, and together I could bring those together. So that was one way I sort of used different conclusions. Another way was supporting evidence, which as I just mentioned with Wolf and Smith's study and Vanderquage, they both said they both found similar conclusions, and so I used that to strengthen my argument and my points that supported my argument. And then my final one was refutation. This wasn't mentioned in my presentation, but in my paper I had a source by Sim Sitkin who argued that avoiding fear was common sense. But then I used Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath, which argues that common sense is not necessarily always in our best interests. So I used that to sort of refute that point, which if Sim Sitkin's point stood, then it might disqualify my argument. So those are the three main ways I use different conclusions to support my argument.
Okay, very nice, thank you.